and I expect that in the next, 5 years, 8 years, right, you will see more and more people either wearing, augmented reality glasses or big devices, when they have a certain situation at home where they want to play or want to watch a movie and so on.
So you think that the adoption, at least from a mainstream level of the metaverse, will happen on a cell phone first? Dirk Lueth, thank you so much for joining us here on Pioneering in the Metaverse. This is Everdome's podcast here, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you because you are a world of knowledge on the metaverse. You do quite a bit. You're the co-founder and co-CEO of Uplandme. You are based in Silicon Valley, and you're a serial entrepreneur. You've been an early blockchain tech adopter. And in addition to being the co-founder and co-CEO of Uplandme, you co-founded and are the chairman, if I'm not mistaken, of the Open Metaverse Alliance for Web3. So OMA3 is for short form. And you're also the author of the best-selling book, Navigating the Metaverse, A Guide to Limitless Possibilities in a Web3 World. And, because there's more, you're the official Metaverse ambassador of the Global Blockchain Business Council. So you do quite a lot. And just before we started recording, you talked about how you put on a lot of hats. So why don't we start with maybe a little bit of an introduction into who Dirk Lueth is and sort of the backstory of how you got into the metaverse.
Yeah, sure. So, Samir, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. And it's clearly stated, my name is Dirk Lueth. I'm originally from Germany, but I live now in the US for almost 15 years, and been in the tech space forever. Also in the entrepreneurial, let's say, environment forever. So that's somehow which never did let me go. Right? I always like to, search for new things, for going where no one has gone before. So Uplandme is actually my 5th company I've started, and I've done a few things before. Also, and that because it came all to this whole blockchain and kind of topic. So I also once wrote a PhD about private and state-controlled currency. It was my dissertation. And that's why I fell in love already in 2011 in blockchain. But, after my studies, I co-founded the Financial Times of Germany, worked there for a while. Then I had a company together with another co-founder in Germany in the fintech space. And then 2009, I moved to Silicon Valley. And back in 2010, or was around 2010-ish of time, I thought actually about how the web is going to evolve. Obviously, when I joined and when I co-founded the Financial Times, what I saw is that, newspaper are going to be replaced by something new, which is more digital. And because I saw that basically transmitting information is going to be free or almost at zero cost, right? Because when you think about what a newspaper did in the previous times, right, you had to print it, that costs money, and you had to distribute it, right? There was also time and money. And last but not least, because you had these restrictions, you were actually never up to date. So when a newspaper came out the next morning, actually it was already old, because a lot of things might have happened, between printing and distribution, right? So that was what the internet was about. And then, of course, the cost basically went almost down to zero, you could say, right? To actually, because anyone can become now a newspaper or a blogger, what it's called then in the web space.
Yeah. Or a podcaster.
A podcaster, right? You see that? Because if you want to start a radio, it was a little bit more expensive in the past, right? Now you just do that, upload it to whatever platform, and then you are. Exactly. That's what media is about. Media has completely changed in that direction. So that means information transportation is free. However, in 2010, I was thinking about, okay, so because it was why I originally joined, where I became, interested in the whole internet space because of, the cheap and almost free transportation of information. But then in 2010, I thought, okay, but this cannot be all what the internet is actually doing, or what, the digital transformation, whatever you call it, is doing it to us, right? And then I thought, okay, because the problem was, when you think about when the web came around, we had web 1.0, right, which was basically, that was actually the newspaper, putting newspapers onto the web. Then in 2010, you had, everyone was talking about social, basically anyone can become a publisher besides blogging, but that was probably the right way of going about it. But then Web 3.0 came around. Okay, so we started in Web 1.0, right? Web 1.0 was about read. You put a newspaper onto the web. Web 2.0 was about that read and write, where you put actually was all the social media, where you could go and post your own things. Again, cost at zero. And now Web 3.0, which is basically read, write, and own, right? Where you own stuff. And that was all about blockchain, because now it was also able to transfer value to other people. Yeah. And when you think about the metaverse, we can talk about that a little bit. There's a different dimension which is, being added to it. When you had Web 2.0 was about, scrolling, you were scrolling through your feed. And now when you have the metaverse, right, it's the next dimension where you actually do things, you act, or you stroll right around in the metaverse, right?
It's no longer just scrolling, it's the ability to go through.
Exactly, right? Yep. So from scrolling to strolling. But back to my personal, Vita, how I got into it. So in 2010, I was thinking about, okay, we had this, cheap, possibility to transport information for free, but how about value? And then I looked at, all those games which are out there, or which were out there at that time. And, they had a lot of currencies. Yeah, in a sense, right? But there were always, game currencies, typical things. They would launch their own currency, which was basically just a database entry, right? At the end of the day. But very often then games played around with it. And, of course, they were control of, a central operator. And then in 2010-ish or so, early 2011, right? A friend of mine told me, hey, there's this new thing called Bitcoin. And I said, never heard about that. Okay, I'll take a look. And then he sent me a link to the white paper. I read that. I said, oh, this is really interesting. And because it solved one big topic, which was double spending, right? Which was a big challenge. And, because when you have a database, you somehow a centralized operator, you're in control of that. But now you had actually Bitcoin, which solved the double spending issue. It solved a lot of other things, right? But it was very important. That's why how I got fascinated into the Bitcoin blockchain space, in 2011 already. So that's how I got into it and never did let go of it.
And here you are. So let's start with, I guess, what's the most obvious question here. As a person who's heavily involved in the Web3 space, you said this is your fifth company in terms of the work that you do with Uplandme. What does the metaverse mean to you? How do you define it?
So the metaverse, I was trying, when I started also Uplandme, right, I always said you have to make things easy to understand, because there's, some definitions of the metaverse which are very long. They're 2 or 3 paragraphs long, right? And also I have to read it 2 or 3 times when I'm trying to understand how others are defining it. I'm trying to find it very simple, even though I do not say that it's complete, but however, because it's an 80-20 rule in certain things, right? Yeah. And I basically say is, actually, the metaverse is a place where you assume one or multiple identity, right? And where you act in a 3D space, right? So that's something, which is clearly about the metaverse. But what is new also, especially about the blockchain-based metaverses, and where you own stuff, right? Owning means that you can also sell it, right? So this is basically the idea. And then you can now add, of course, the whole idea of a metaverse is saying where anything you can imagine can exist, right? So those things, identity, owning, imagination, everything exists, right? And where where you do things.
And what do you think is the biggest barrier to adoption of the metaverse? Because for someone like you and I who have knowledge of the metaverse, we can see the potential of it. That answer might be a little bit obvious. But for the average person who is hearing about the metaverse and thinking, is this just another video game? What is it that's preventing more mainstream adoption of it?
I think you say it right. First of all, because lots of video games are, to my mind, mistakenly also called metaverses these days, right? So I want to name out, but some of them have millions, not if not 100 millions of users.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically where people, assume an identity and they move in 3D spaces. Yeah, so that's already happening. However, in most of the cases which have that big of attraction, they do not really own stuff there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing, right? So there's one component of the four I mentioned earlier somehow missing. And there you could clearly say, hey, you have mass adoption, right? If you take now Minecraft, Fortnite, and Roblox, right? You have millions and millions of people playing on a daily active, basis. So that's already there. However, it's not completely the metaverse. It's still a game, right? You can always, and when you're in the gaming space, you can always launch a successful game or not, right? That's always a 0-1 decision very often, right? But but that's what we have today, right? But when you think about when you want to really have this fourth component where you own things, where you become, the potential seller of your own items, you're in control of your data, you're in control of your identity. That's where blockchain actually comes in. What is very important. And I think the biggest barrier to entry here is still that it's most of the time very complicated. So if you want to, that's the first thing, right? Complicated means is that people have to deal with, private keys, wallets, passphrases, and so on. And people really don't want to deal with that, even though many people will probably understand, oh, when I have that in control, I'm actually, it's me. There's no one who can take it away from me. But I think I'm very sure, I've never seen it, but if you do a market survey of, let's say, majority of the, of the population of people, the answer would be, I prefer, that actually I can call someone, that I can, send an email to someone, because when I lose that stuff, I want someone to help me, right? People don't care that much about this last piece of, self-custody and so on.
They prefer the convenience, ultimately.
Exactly, right. Yeah. So that's the first barrier, right, which is still tricky, which is getting solved, right, in certain ways right now. The second one is then, of course, you have to get somehow, if you have to pay with crypto, everything, that's also tricky. Mm-hmm. Right? That's many people, we still know that not everyone owns crypto and don't want to own it, because everyone sees now the ups and downs and so on, that they don't feel comfortable. So you actually have to add in still something they feel comfortable with, i.e. fiat. Right. And the second thing is that they need to use what they do on an everyday basis, basically, use credit cards, PayPal, and all that stuff, right? This, which will help us. So these are, let's say, the more on the infrastructure layer, the problems, right, which you have to solve, or challenges. And the other one is, of course, when you want to come in and someone should use it on a daily basis. First of all, either you create a game what people really like, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like with any game, right? If it's good, if it is an interesting game mechanics in there and reasons for people to come back, to share it with friends and so on, right? Then it works. That's one aspect of it. But when you speak of the metaverse in general, not everything is gamey, right? Everything has to, it can be not outside of games. I mean, you think of business to business, people are talking about digital twins or so. So when you have a clear use case, right, where when you work with the metaverse, right, you have to have an advantage, right? So for instance, like we do this in a certain way right now on Zoom calls, right? But just imagine you have a room where you can go in, you can meet people, at a conference, virtual conference, and so on. Once people are used to it, once the technology is a little bit better, right, I'm sure that this will also drive adoption, let's say, more on the business side, right? So either it's entertainment where you get people excited, or there's a clear problem solving on the business side, which brings it together. But then the third thing is somehow it has to become our, let's say, daily companion in a certain way. Yeah, and then you think about today, it's the mobile phone. So use it, of course, for private reasons to do something on there, but also business reasons, right? When you're on your regular work day, you do your Slack messages or emails or data program, whatever.
And you can pretty much do all of that on a phone now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It needs to be integrated in your daily workflow, right? First of all, it has to give you an advantage because it's mobile. That's one thing, right? On the other hand, it has to be, it has to be some, productivity advantage or so, right? To make people really move.
Right. So to go back for a moment, you talked about either entertainment or problem solving for businesses as sort of the intro to more mainstream adoption. Do you see one being more likely than the other? In my mind, for example, I think entertainment is the path of lesser resistance because people are more quicker to adopt new forms of entertainment methods, that new fan experience, the ability to feel like you're part of, the next World Cup or whatever you want in that scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And when you look at the past, how actually, technology has been, adopted by people, like in the very early days. So we have actually usually three different, let's say, stakeholders, right? You had government, you had companies, and you had consumers. When you look back like 50 years ago or so, right, technology was first in governments, right? How it came through, and then governments used it, and some companies used it, and at the end, eventually consumers, like 50 years ago. Then 20 years ago, or whatever, 20, 30 years ago, actually was the other way around, was first companies, right? And which were the first adopters, right? Because you had Microsoft with Windows coming up, and then, you did your accounting on yet Excel and so on, but still was not consumer. And then actually what happened then at a certain time, when especially when mobile came around, consumer came first. Yeah, and that's where, especially, with the Apple devices coming up and so on, like 15, 20 years ago. It's not that long time ago when you think about it.
No.
And that's where the consumer was the main driver, and that had an impact also on the other stakeholders. So that means the consumers, they were used now to have a really nice, of course, Apple-ish typical thing, right? A slick interface and, very intuitive and so on to use. So that has meant that also the business software had to adopt to that, because it was always, I remember that like 10 years ago, you had great interfaces on the mobile devices, but then you went to work and then you had to work with really old-fashioned stuff and complicated. But this is changing. Also, one of the reasons then software as a service came up, because this was somehow the prosumers, right? You had maybe people installing Slack, even though the corporate IT didn't allow it, right? But it was just more comfortable to use it. And then, once you had so many users all of a sudden in a company, then corporate IT had, maybe we should allow it now officially and so on, right? So that's a little bit, the way things have developed.
And in terms of the actual technology, so obviously experiencing things in a 3D environment in order to be able to actually stroll through, as you called it, we're not quite there yet. There are things like the MetaQuest, I think it's called, and I know Apple recently unveiled that they're going to be releasing a new product in that realm as well. But those are going to be premier products that are not affordable, let's say, for the everyday consumer, where it's going to be mass adoption that quickly. But outside of products like that, where do you see we are in the technology scale? How far along are we? And at what point do you think we'll need to get to before you can really fully immerse yourself in a metaverse?
So I'd like to challenge us first, at least for the moment, that you really need to immerse completely, right? So when you think immersion, it doesn't have to be that you have to wear a headset all the time. Not at the moment, at least, because people are just not used to it, wearing this clunky devices.
Bulky thing, yeah.
So some people, of course, the early adopters are doing it, but again, when we speak about mass adoption, people don't know what that really means at the end of the day, and there will be probably different use cases where it starts becoming, more used by average people. When you think about the Apple device, which you've mentioned, right, is the video I've seen. Unfortunately, I have not, worn this Vision Pro device headset yet, but people were sitting on the couch and watching a movie together, right? I thought it was an interesting use case, because obviously, on the couch, you're pretty much relaxed and you don't walk around with this thing, right? But you get probably a better immersive experience. However, it's still mixed with the real world. So you can turn a wheel, and then maybe you sit your partner sitting right next to you, right? You still feel that you're together watching that one movie, right? Instead of putting on a big screen at home or a big TV set or so. So I think these kind of things where it's slightly, or let's say where it slowly will get into our daily life, certain ways. Then you have maybe the augmented reality glasses, right? First of all, you have simple versions where they are not that heavy anymore, right? So it looks like glasses I'm wearing right now, very simple glasses, but you have maybe an enhanced vision of, of your world as you go through a normal street, in a real world street. And then you see certain things and so on. It's getting slowly there. And then we'll have more and more. But this is also very much, when you think about still today, in some cases, you're using your PC. In other cases, you're using mobile phone, right? It's not either or. So, yeah, I said, it always depends on the use case, right? Mm-hmm. How are you going to use a certain device, right? There will be good use cases for VR, AR, right? And also today, it's mainly still mobile phone because people are used to be, 80% of their access to the internet per day is at least on the phone, I tend to say, right? That's the reason why the metaverse also will, at the beginning, will be probably most successful on the phone, where you go into a 3D room and not yet, that's where the mass adoption will come from. And then, the other devices, the Quest or the Vision Pro, right? The early adopters will buy it, and others will see that as well. They will try it out. And then over time, and I expect that in the next, 5 years, 8 years, right? You will see more and more people either wearing, augmented reality glasses or big devices, when they have a certain situation at home where they want to play or want to watch a movie and so on.
So you think that the adoption, at least from a mainstream level, of the metaverse will happen on a cell phone first?
Yeah.
Okay. And you don't think that the size of the cell phone will create a restriction in the sense of you're looking at a very compact screen, which again, when people think of the metaverse, like if we're thinking about how people who, let's say, play video games and enter those sort of immersive worlds, and then they sort of really adopt all of that, they partake in the economy, we'll call it, of that video game, the world that the developers have built. You don't tend to see a lot of that happening on small mobile devices because they're getting smaller. They're opting in more so for either gaming consoles or for laptops, desktops. Do you see the size of a mobile device being an issue for that kind of adoption?
First of all, I think you're completely right. There will be use cases also in the metaverse where you want to do and access it through the mobile, through your PC, right? Yeah. Because you're doing something like a Fortnite or a big game, or you have to have that experience, those, very almost like the real world looking type of, environment. So that's going to be, of course, one use case, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, depends again on what kind of platform of the metaverse you go into. But in some cases, you only want to socialize with others and want to hang out with them. And I'm not so sure whether you really need the, the full big screen at that moment, right? You can walk through, you meet someone, and then you talk through voice or video, right? With someone like today, I'm doing some of my calls, my Zoom calls also on my phone because I'm just on, because
on
I'm
the go,
out there somewhere on the go. I need to have that. So, but I think, but still, the majority will probably start with the phone if it's well done, right? And however, then there will be good use cases where the people go on the big screen.
And when you talk about for example, you and a friend deciding you want to watch a movie and you're utilizing the metaverse as the platform or the environment to go and do that. Obviously, for the metaverse to be adopted at a mainstream level, there's the consumer part and then there's the business part of things. From a business perspective, what kind of examples or use cases can you see for metaverse adoption? And do you see any situations where the adoption of the metaverse could be problematic for some businesses? Because I'm thinking, to your example, movie theaters might think, well, this is going to be problematic for us because now all of a sudden that's even more reasons for people not to come into our theaters. They already have streaming platforms at home. Maybe now there's even more reasons why we're not going to fill bums in seats type of thing.
Yeah, I think what never happens is when you try to copy, let's say, an existing understanding of a particular media type into this new device, right? That never works. Remember when the iPad has launched, they had a bookshelf at the beginning where you could pick a book, and that's something, which is just not working. You have always to adapt to each device in a certain way, right? But I think that is the same also true then for, let's say, okay, let's think about when a VR headset, whenever it comes around, what will make it a success also is that you actually can do things you cannot do with a regular TV set, or you cannot do with a phone, obviously. And the way I see it, and I don't know whether it's going to look like it, but the way you're going to watch a movie in the future will be, maybe you sit down on your couch, right? And maybe you have to do a small quest first, through your phone, through your device, right? You have to walk around yourself and you have to do something. And only when you did that, then the movie starts, right? And then you have maybe then, because also when you think about it now, thanks to AI, we can create so many 3D objects. You have so-called NPCs, non-player characters, which can be managed by AI. So there will be a different type of movie experience going forward, right, in your home. When it comes to the theater now, because the theater is, why did I go in the past into the theater? Because I want to hang out with my friends and want to do something there. Because in theater, I could have watched, TV at home, and then if in the most recent times, I could watch Netflix or whatever, right? So I think then you have to, transfer that concept then also to the movie theater, where maybe only the people who are together in the movie theater, maybe they have to do joint quests together, right? Just to do something, and then only the movie starts, right? Maybe you have to walk around the movie theater to do something. Now something is projected onto the walls, you can see that, and you have to grab it and do something with it, and so on. So the whole movie theater experience becomes much more elaborated in a certain sense, and that's where I think then people will go there, because this is an experience you cannot have at home, because obviously you're just there with one friend or maybe two or three, but not with 50 or 100. Now you can have a completely different, also experience of the whole movie. It's not just a movie anymore. It's an entertainment experience.
And I imagine in that scenario, you could almost extend that or expand it, and you can have all 50 of your friends, whereas it's hard to get 50 of your friends in one movie theater at the same time. Now you can all get together and, watch the movie that you wanted to watch collectively. And that's just movie theaters. That's not counting, watching a UFC match or a soccer match or whatever you want in that scenario. Replace X with anything. The ability to integrate and have that many people in one place, doing the same thing and experiencing it at the same time with each other is part of the use case or the benefit of doing it in the metaverse per se.
Absolutely, right. Just think about like when you mentioned now, you want to watch a football game or soccer game, right? So now, people now you're going actually to movie theater to watch it, right? And now, the 50 people there, they compete against, the ones in Cleveland, compete against the ones in San Francisco, whatever, right? So, so this can become, you can have completely new ways of interaction, right? And again, people don't have to be in the same location. However, when you have this location, you can say, okay, because they are in the same location, they form a team and compete against others. So I think there's super interesting concepts, that's what is so interesting. People always, when they think about new technology, I always think, oh, I only see what's there today, but they don't think about what other
what's
possibilities,
possible. Yeah,
what's gonna come, right?
Well, speaking of what's coming, and part of it is already here, is artificial intelligence, and you brought that up a little bit earlier. I'm curious to hear your perspective on where you see artificial intelligence playing a role in the metaverse, because that tech has obviously been adopted in so many different areas, and it's only going to continue being adopted. It's one of those things where now that it's on, you can't really stop it. Where do you see AI playing a role in the metaverse, particularly perhaps when it comes to maybe NPCs or in other ways?
Yeah, I see that especially. Let's start maybe with the operators, the people who are starting and building the metaverse for others, right? So I think, and we do that, by the way, also in Upland. So when we're creating now 3D assets, we're using AI to create those much faster, right? Because our creative director just, he did overview how much faster he got, and he said he's estimating that he's 70 to 80% faster because of AI. So, which is a big advantage now, because now he can create many more things. Because our bottleneck was always when we're partnering with FIFA, which is a partner of ours, or the NFL Player Association, right? We always had the issue that we had to create so many assets, and it took so much time and so many people. And it's not just the people; it's also coordination, getting everything right, and so on. So that's on that end, as a company, you can save a lot of costs and become faster, which is great news. Yeah. But then, as a company, you can also do other things, right? You can allow now user-generated content, right? So to do that and using AI, you give the right tools. So because when you think about, most people don't know really how to use Blender or Photoshop and whatever to create. But now, but anyone can speak to something, right? Now people can maybe use, their words to say, "Hey, create me a dog surfing on a surfboard on a big wave," or whatever. Right? So you can, so that becomes now interesting. Now also the users can create more assets, right? And you have certain quality criteria when they can upload it or not. You can have that, right? So, but also that process can be controlled then by AI, right? Did those users who created those assets, did they meet the requirements you have set out, right? And AI will support doing that and checking that, so you don't have a lengthy process of people or manual process of the people in your team to look through it. Yeah. So this is on the production side. And production side, there's many other things. People can create their rooms and say, "Hey, draw me an office space with 6 tables in there and whatever amount of chairs," and then AI can create that room for you. So you don't need to work with Unity or all the other you can work still with Unity, but however the AI does actually creation for you at that moment, right? So spaces and so on.
Where do you? Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Continue.
No, and then the other thing is, of course, on the consumer side itself, right? So then you have the non-player characters. I mentioned that before. You can have, and you have there's also maybe also security improves, right? So you can actually check if there's people are using bad words or hate speech and whatever. So you can have also AI looking through things which you are challenged when you're the operator of a metaverse to ensure that it's also kind of a safe place and not being used by by bad actors.
I'm glad you actually bring that up, because now I have an interesting question for you. Where does with whom does the responsibility lie for governance in the metaverse? Because obviously within our societies, we're governed by the laws that in the city or the state that we live in. In the metaverse, being a digital environment, the question is who sort of dictates what's, and we're not necessarily going to get into how we define hate speech, but let's just say, for example, someone says something that's an obvious piece of hate speech. Who governs those kinds of things, especially in a place like the metaverse, where the idea is for people to go in and experience things as they want?
Yeah, so the first challenge is to have the metaverse in general per se, it's global. Right. So it means we see that also in Uplandme, right? We have people coming together in San Francisco, but they're coming from Germany, Japan, and so on. They're building their own nodes there, and they've never met him in real life, right? But somehow they're gathering together in a virtual location. You have that everywhere. We call that also the concept virtual locality, right? Because whatever reason they came together there, it's very much when you think about the real world, right? People are coming together in a country and they decide, okay, I'm a citizen of that country. I respect, the rules of that country or not, right? But the laws and so on. But that's what is happening, right? So, and then, so first of all, somehow you have to define, okay, what is this place where people are coming together? And then you have to, as an operator, you have to give the rules that those people in that space can define the rules themselves for that space in a certain way. Yeah. However, it cannot be completely detached from, let's say, rules or norms or whatever we have given ourselves in the real world. Yeah. But sometimes, you just mentioned, some cases are very obvious, but some things are, accepted in one culture, they're not accepted in a different culture, right? That's always a challenge again, right? I mean, because now we have people coming from all over the world in one space, and, some people have a certain way of thinking while others don't, right? So they need to come together, but they need to then form themselves. And as an operator of a platform, you have to give them the tools to vote about things and to, self-correct things.
So right? Self-governance.
self-governance, right? But as an operator, you cannot go. Also, it's almost impossible to do that, right? Just imagine, now we have in a metaverse, you have hundred thousands of different communities, and they think you cannot just say, hey, this is right or this is wrong, right? This is just not possible, right? Also, very often people expect you to become somehow the judge of certain things, and sometimes I myself just don't know what the right decision is right at this time, and the only way it can work is really via self-governance.
Okay. What about interoperability between metaverses? So obviously Upland has a metaverse that it's building. Everdome has a metaverse that it's building. You've got other projects like Decentraland and whatnot. Do you believe that for the metaverse to be built, maybe correctly is not the right word, but to be built, that there needs to be interoperability between these metaverses, that they need to be able to speak to each other, so that, for example, if I, Samir, am interested in participating in Upland and then tomorrow want to move over to Everdome and then the day after move somewhere else, that I have that free-flowing ability of moving through digital environments while maybe keeping my avatar, let's say?
Yeah, I think that is very important. This is also the new paradigm, because if we just create, let's say, blockchain or whatever in metaverse now, the way we did create games in the past, then we did not really advance in a certain way, right?
I'd agree.
So I think, especially when you think about blockchain and interoperability, this is part of the new paradigm, so of the paradigm shift. That means, I think, also to make it really compelling, that's not just one or two companies owning everything or owning the users. You need to be interoperable, right? That's one of the reasons in Upland. So this is actually one of the biggest mission I have personally for the whole space. So in Upland, we created various things, right? So right now we have a third-party developer platform where we can connect to other worlds. We can connect to Web 2 and Web 3 games, and users are at the center. They can take their identity and their assets into the other world and also bring their assets back, or also assets from the other world. So that's something we have built already. We have what is called a token portal, where people can export their, so-called NFTs to other worlds and bring them back in. Right, so that is something we envision on the Upland side. How I said always, this is not enough, right? We have to go one step further, and one step is that roughly a year ago, right, I invited all the big metaverses together, and we formed actually what is called OMA 3, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast here, Open Metaverse Alliance for Web 3. And the idea is to bring forward interoperability with the ultimate vision that the user is at the center, the user is at the control of everything, and that what you just mentioned is an ideal solution. And there's a lot of technical problems to it, and a few other kind of problems. Yeah. But an ideal solution is that the user is at the center, meaning he can take his identity, can take his assets from one world to the other. There are portals, right? So actually in OMA 3, we have a work group which is called Portaling Work Group. So where you can actually very easily go from one world to the other. It's very cool, right? You see that it's, you're in one world, and then you see actually a portal. You see through the portal, you see already the other world, right? And then you can walk through. But there's a lot of, details problem to it. So what does it mean when you take your assets with you? Do the assets have the same kind of value? Do they look the same, right? There's a lot of answers, which we are searching, and, and questions which needs to be answered, right? So one answer is also to think about standardization or interoperability, because that's exactly what you need at the end, standards, right? From a different perspective. So we also started as Upland again an initiative called Species. So it's on the species.io, where very early days to build that, but the idea is to create standards for life. So when Samir wants to start now let's say gorilla in the metaverse, right? You can go and define it, how it looks, how it reproduces, and how long does it live, and all these questions, and then that has to be adopted by a standards committee, right? We have created a DAO in Switzerland for that. And then once you have that, right, metaverses, not just Upland, any metaverse, Web 2 metaverse, Everdome, they could adopt that standard, right? And this, it becomes much more easier also to create interoperability between the different worlds.
So you're essentially building out a framework of which these metaverses would operate within. so that there's some
Yes.
form of guidance, or for lack of a better term, rules that, can at least govern or provide direction when you come across a new paradigm or a new problem.
That's exactly the idea, right? If you think about Bluetooth, right? If every device would have a different, Bluetooth standard, they just wouldn't talk to each other. It's just not working. That's why you need the standards to create this interoperability.
And are you seeing from the groups that are part of OMA 3, are you seeing that the willingness or the want to create more interoperability between projects is very much alive and well? Like they're very much invested in making this happen, or are you seeing resistance in some parts of the space?
No, we see that, of course, happening, right? No, and very often that is very typical for standards organization, right? You always have someone who has developed something, but he thinks that's worth creating a standard out of it. So there's always very often self-interest by the companies joining. But this is where all standard committees work like that, and that's also could make sense because there's someone who's really vested into it, has an interest. Right, but in order to make it happen, right, he needs actually the buy-in from others, which makes it interesting, right? There's also other standards organizations out there in the metaverse, like the MSF, the Metaverse Standards Forum, or IEEE. There, we already have or will have, what is called liaison agreements with them, right? Just to work together with them on certain standards, so you don't have really competing standards.
Yeah. So what's next for Dirk? You said you're working on 5 companies. You've got you're a chairman of OMA 3. You're the ambassador, as I mentioned, in the Global Blockchain Business Council. There's a lot that's on your plate. How are you managing all of these different things while still working as co-founder and co-CEO?
So first of all, Uplandme is my number one priority. That's clear, right? But however, I think to bring the mission forward of Uplandme, I need to do these other things as well, right? First of all, why I wrote the book, I also have a podcast called Navigating the Metaverse I did with Tin Takashi, right? So the idea is really basically is to export our thinking, to find others, who are thinking, about the same space as well, right? To actually make that more palatable for average people, for the media, so it comes out, right? So this is part of why we're doing this so-called thought leadership. The second thing is then creating OMA 3 was also part of that, because all of a sudden, because we said we can, as Uplandme, not create all the standards, there must be someone independent doing it in a certain way, right? So that's why we created. So it's always somehow interconnected, species interconnected, because we want to introduce life into Uplandme. So that's the reason there was a problem which we had, was that, again, we should not do it by ourselves. But we have the mission to really build these interoperable metaverses, right? Is our approach the best? I don't know, but I hope I can contribute so that, that it will hopefully exist in 10, 15 years, that, when we think back and say, oh, of course, now I can walk from one world to the other.
Sure, yeah. And one final question, if I may. You mentioned that Uplandme does work with FIFA, the NFL Players Association. My question is more so around, what are you seeing from big organizations like those in terms of what their wants are from the metaverse? When an organization as big as those says, hey, I'm interested in stepping into the metaverse in some capacity, generally speaking, what are they looking for that makes sense for an organization like that?
Well, all these companies have different reasons to do that, right? But what is probably makes them all, working on a common goal is, they want to be still relevant in 5 or 10 years, right? So when I'm in a big sports association, right, and I see that kids, they're playing more and more mobile games or just general games, right? So that, they are watching, maybe they're playing less a sport, they're watching less a sport, right? So now you could say, okay, we just have to accept it, or maybe you go there, and if you can't, fight it, you join them,
yeah.
right? So, and then they have a reason, right? So now you find those big sports brands also in the metaverse, or they're experimenting right now, because there's no easy to say, hey, this is exactly the concept how it should work, right? So they get into it and then actually keep being relevant. When you're a big consumer brand, so hard now to find those younger kids because obviously they're watching less and less television, right? That they're using less and less social media, at least not all of it, right? So how, when you're a big consumer brand, how do you reach people? Well, you have to go where they are.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the reason why they have to play around and experiment the same thing, those big consumer brands, in order to reach their future customers.
So it sounds like the advice here would be, at least for businesses and brands, is that, there isn't necessarily a path from A to Z that'll show you how you can enter into the metaverse and create your brand in the metaverse. You kind of have to experiment because of where it's at right now. In my mind, the metaverse is, still in its infancy. Essentially, it's still growing. It's still sort of becoming what it's going to become. And for brands who want to take advantage of that early adopter mentality, there is going to be some experimentation involved, and they will have to accept some degree of that.
Yeah, I think in general, the expectations were set very high. When Mark Zuckerberg published his video in 21, everyone thought it's already here, which it wasn't, right? And then people woke up 1.5 years later, so, and then, the narrative about the metaverse has changed. But, on contrary, I don't think that metaverse is dead, right? It's just going, at the speed it was supposed to go at the moment. And as you already said, it's at the very early days. I always say, when you think about a whole year, maybe we're January 2nd today, So where, in terms of where the metaverse will go, but I think it will come for sure, because we see the evidence of all the kids they're playing. They're used to having those 3D environments, assuming different identities. Just harder for the older generations. It was already hard for the very old generations to adopt to digital transformation. Now, let's say baby boomers, or maybe even the millennials, right? For them, it's hard to imagine, that people will spend time in the metaverse. But for the young kids, that's pretty much normal.
Amazing. Incredible. Dirk, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining us here on Pioneering in the Metaverse. This was an insightful conversation. I'm excited to see all the different things that you're doing with Upland and with OMA 3. And here's to building out a metaverse that everybody can experience one day. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.